We're good to go. Good morning, good day, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Welcome to our next Monday call, and welcome on the behalf of the European Leadership Network of FELNET to this Monday Zoom briefing. My name is Carsten Ovens, and I'm the CEO of the European Leadership Network in Germany. As you know by now, FELNET, we are the premier organization to foster relations between Europe and Israel, which is nowadays more needed than ever. Israel is threatened and very often under attack from Iran and its proxies, as well as from other hostile actors in the region, but also from anti-Semites around the world. Sometimes with rockets, sometimes with knives, sometimes the enemies use cyber tools, and sometimes international forums. And this is what we are going to talk about today, the campaign to delegitimize Israel. Before we start, we'd like to use the opportunity to give you a brief update and some insights into the largest research project FELNET has across Europe, which is called the Israel Survey. Some of you who have been with us in Paris have already seen some of the numbers, but to have some facts to start our conversation today with, it's my very pleasure to present you some of the unique results. And we're happy to share the presentation afterwards and also send you the PDF file of the survey and its unique results. Just in a nutshell, what this study is about and why it's important also for our talk today. For the first time, FELNET surveyed members of 17 European parliaments, including the European Parliament, on bilateral relations between Israel and the Middle East and Europe, and European policies vis-à-vis Israel and the Middle East. 381 MPs participated in this unique study. The survey invitations were sent to all MPs from the various parliaments in February and March. So the study was conducted online. And just two numbers to start with: 28% of those MPs who participated say they know FELNET well, and 75% have been to Israel. So that means, on the one hand, we are in a very good position. And on the other hand, it means there's a lot of potential to do more in Europe, which is why your support at Friends of FELNET is so much needed and so much appreciated for our work here on the ground. So coming into let's start with the details. First of all, a good news is that the relations between Europe and Israel from a European policymakers' perspective are generally seen in good shape. A quarter of the MPs who participated say that there is even improvement in bilateral relations over the past 5 years. And 82% of European MPs believe that the relations with the Jewish homeland are somewhat special. The majority says due to the European, in particular German, historical responsibility, but also because of common values and security reasons, something we will speak about today. And another good news is 77% of European parliamentarians call for closer cooperation with Israel. And if you have a deeper look into the findings, you will see that education and science, but also defense and homeland security, as well as innovation issues like health and climate, are on the forefront when it comes to specific topics European MPs would like to intensify, deepen, and broaden the collaboration between their home country here in Europe and the State of Israel. Another good news is there is a high support for an active role, an even more active role than it is today, of Europe in the Middle East, which is, when it comes to the delegitimization of Israel, very much needed. Having said that, 2/3 of MPs across Europe want closer NATO cooperation with Israel, and 76% of European MPs say that their country should become more active within the framework of the Abraham Accords. Last but not least, 70% support a closer alignment with Israel and a strong role of their country in containing Iranian activities against Israel and in the region. However, there's always a downside. And of course, you could frame this in a positive way and say more than half of European parliamentarians have realized that Israel-related anti-Semitism is a significant problem in their country. But it also means, yes, indeed, anti-Zionism or a campaign around the delegitimization of the Jewish state is indeed a problem that we need to reach out to European policymakers, to inform them, to educate them, to show them also the threats on the one hand, but the opportunities and what to do against this campaign on the other hand. And while anti-Semitism is perceived as coming from all parts of society, in many countries around Europe, they see that anti-Semitism coming from Islamist communities is #1 threat, while in the majority of European countries, including Germany, they see anti-Semitism coming from the radical right as the biggest threat to Jewish life around the world. Having said that, I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Let me just stop sharing, because when it comes to the campaign of delegitimization of Israel, then I couldn't think of any better expert than we have here today with us, Colonel of Reserve Pnina Sharvit Baruch, the head of program on law and national security at the Israel Institute for National Security Studies, INSS. And as you read from her bio in the invitation, among many other impressive steps in her career, Pnina served on Israel's delegation for negotiations with the Palestinians from 1993 to until 2006, as well as with Syria in 2000. So with all this experience of so many years, on the one hand, in direct negotiations, on the other hand, on an academic perspective, Pnina, it's amazing to have you with us here today. So welcome again to this Monday Zoom call. And
thank you.
Maybe
Thank
we
you for inviting me.
With pleasure. And maybe we start with a very simple and broad question. What actually do we understand when we speak about the delegitimization of Israel in general?
So I think when we talk about delegitimization, which is a very difficult word, of Israel, it's something that goes beyond just criticizing Israel. I mean, states criticize each other in the international arena. That's something that is done, and it's okay to criticize. But I think what we see when it comes to Israel, I think is signaling out of Israel compared to other countries. And we see, I think the difference, we can see it in 3 different levels. The first is the scope, okay? Many countries are criticized, or sometimes they are also receive resolutions that condemn their activity, but no country receives as many condemnations in the international arena, especially in the UN, as Israel. So if we look at the figures, there's a site of UN Watch. They have a database where they collect all the resolutions against Israel and compare them to other countries. So just looking, for example, the Human Rights Council condemnatory resolutions from 2006 to the present, 42 Syria, 60 North Korea, 14 Iran, 12 Eritrea, 2 Sudan, 3 Venezuela, 6 Russia, 0 Saudi, Turkey, Zimbabwe, Israel, 103. Okay, so, and if we look at the UN General Assembly, again, the figure is, you have 10 on Syria, 23 on Russia, 8 on North Korea, 140 resolutions on Israel, condemning Israel. So I think the first is the scope. It's not proportionate to anything. The second one, I think, is also the language and the intent. It's not just criticizing Israel of harming the human rights, it's apartheid. Or discriminating, it's apartheid. It's not just not abiding by the laws of armed conflict or even war crimes, it's genocide, it's ethnic cleansing. So everything is very worded in very extreme wordings compared to others. And I think the third is also the outcome. What does it lead to? The criticism on other countries, even when they are criticized, so the governments are criticized, but it's not, the criticism is not against all the people. You can still have them appear in the university. And also the criticism doesn't lead to an idea that that state doesn't have a right to exist. When it comes to Israel, the criticism is translated into delegitimizing the right of Israel to exist. And I think these 3 phenomena make it something different to what other countries face when we're talking about the criticizing them in the international arena.
Okay, very well. So we see the issue has multiple layers. So it's of course not easy. And how would you say, how can we differentiate this from, let's call it, appropriate criticism? So scope, yes, okay, language is okay, but the devil is always in the details. So what would you say can we do?
So first of all, I think we have to be aware of these double standards that are used. When you look at reports, I for example, examined in depth. There was a commission of the Human Rights Council. Every time there is a military campaign, they always immediately, like vis-a-vis Gaza, the Gaza Strip, immediately the resolution condemning Israel, even if we're in the middle of the fighting, and a commission of inquiry is immediately established. So we had the Goldstone report after cast-led operation. I was in charge of the legal advice to the military in a cast-led operation. When I read the report, I couldn't sleep for a few nights because there were allegations of war crimes and other allegations that had no basis in reality. I was there. I know exactly what we did. Then there was, after a protective edge, that was 2008, 2009. Then in 2014, there was a protective edge. I was already a reservist. And again, there was a commission of inquiry, this time led by McGavin Davies. It was supposed to be Charles Shabas in the beginning, appointed to head this commission of inquiry, until it was found that he was giving a paid advice to the Palestinians how to bring Israel to the International Criminal Court. So he had to step down. Anyway, this report was not worded as strongly as the Goldstone report, but when you read it, it was still very biased, very one-sided against Israel. And I made an in-depth analysis of this report based on not on anything secret, just on, and I found that there was, except the bias, there was the facts were distorted. The law was distorted. There was no understanding or an attempt to understand the complexity of a situation, of a combat situation. But also what you saw was in the wording, every time it was said, for example, Israel attacked and killed or injured Palestinians and destroyed this and that. And then on the other side, it was said, Israel claimed that it was attacked by, that the rockets were fired and that Israelis were injured. And we see that all the time, this wording. One side, it's clear cut fact, the other one is claiming. And I think, so first of all, we have to be aware that whatever is said is not always accurate and is not always fair. And secondly, I think the focus is really that it is okay to criticize, but when it comes to making allegations that are baseless without understanding, for example, if we're talking about armed conflict situations, the complexity of the situation, the complexity of fighting in an urban area. And then we can bring examples from the US and other coalition forces when they fought in Afghanistan or in Iraq or in Syria. They had many civilian casualties. They had more civilian casualties in some cases than what Israel has fighting in the most densely populated area in the Gaza Strip. And then when you compare, you see that Israel applies the same standards, even limits itself more. For example, by giving, for example, there's the issue of precautions. Israel gives warnings, precise warnings before targeting certain buildings, for example, in the Gaza Strip, if the aim is to target a facility. That are unprecedented. I wrote an article about it, and I came to the Naval War College in the US to present my paper on warnings prior to attack. And then they told me, and I wrote an article for their book, their blue book, and they told me just one thing we ask you, please make it clear that the level of warnings that Israel supplies is not obligatory according to international law. It's something that you do beyond what the law requires because we don't have that standard. So I think really it's understanding the complexity. On the Palestinian issue, yes, there is, I think it is complex. I believe that we need to talk to negotiate with the Palestinians. We need to find a solution. But again, I think the main idea is to understand that it is so complicated. It is not bad and good. There's no clear-cut answer, a clear-cut solution that Israel is just not agreeing to implement. And I think by explaining a bit of the complexity, maybe at least to those that want to hear, we can make it a little bit, the criticism a little bit less extreme.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, very well. In our invitation, and you already mentioned it, we are speaking about a campaign that is used to delegitimize Israel. So what do we mean by campaign? Who is behind this campaign? Who is participating in this campaign? What is the ultimate intention of this campaign?
So I think that from the Palestinian, you have many elements in the Palestinian camp. It begins also with the Palestinian Authority, but also NGOs and many also Palestinians from the exile that decided that they will have a campaign in the international arena aimed to use legal terms, some call it lawfare, against Israel. And this is so it begins with these condemnations and UN resolutions and the commissions of inquiry and rapporteurs. There's a whole system of rapporteurs that deal with the Palestinian occupied territories more than any other place in the world. Each report is always very, very bad. So it begins with that, but then the idea is also to utilize it in two ways. First of all, on the diplomatic front, to persuade governments and bodies and institutions that Israel is not legitimate, not to cooperate with Israel, not to invest in Israel, not to talk in universities. So this whole campaign also with states, of course, trying to impact their policies, which is more difficult because states have their interests and are more aware of the complexities. But still this is an attempt. And the second one is to use legal tools in legal institutions. And we have two main or three actually main tracks now that are open. The one is the International Criminal Court, where there was a request by the Palestinians made already there was the first one in 2009, but I will put that aside because it didn't go forward. But in 2015, the Palestinian Authority joined the Rome Protocol that established the International Criminal Court and gave it jurisdiction to investigate the war crimes that were carried out in Palestine, the state of Palestine. Israel, of course, said there's no such thing, state of Palestine, and it doesn't have any territory, but the previous prosecutor, decided to overrule, not to accept this position, and they decided that the court has jurisdiction, because the court only has jurisdiction on crimes that are committed in the territory of a state party to the Rome Protocol, or a member or citizen of a state party, and Israel is not a party to the Rome Protocol, but it decided that there is such a thing as Palestine, and the territory of Palestine is all the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, and decided to open an investigation into the war crimes committed by all sides, all parties, Israelis and Palestinians alike, in these territories since June 2014, 13th of June, just before Protective Edge started. So we have an open investigation there. It's still on not going forward very quickly. The current prosecutor, I don't think is really interested in pursuing this investigation, but once it's open, it's difficult to close. And the idea there is to try to bring Israeli leaders and commanders and soldiers and to prosecute them as war criminals also with regard to acts that were carried out during armed conflict situations, but also the whole issue of settlements is deemed as a war crime of transferring population from the occupying power into the occupied territory. So the whole issue of settlements is also also a war crime under the Rome Statute. So that's one, and a very concrete threat to Israel, because once there are, for example, the court can issue warrants, arrest warrants, and once it does issue those, so all the states that are parties, let's say 140, over 140 states must comply and arrest someone who reaches their territory and transfer them to The Hague. So that's a considerable threat. The second one is the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, that also sits in The Hague, but it's a different court. And here we have a request on the 31st of December 2022, the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly requested advisory opinion by the ICJ about the illegality, actually, of Israel's lengthy occupation of the occupied Palestinian territories. And here we presume that there will be an advisory opinion that will be very critical of Israel, because it is based again on all these commission of inquiries, all these reports by NGOs and by other bodies that are very critical, and also because we know that in previously, with regard to the fence, the wall, that Israel established when we had the terror attacks every second day inside Israel, there was an advisory opinion in 2004 that was very critical of the settlement and of Israel's policies. And the third one is also a procedure in the CERD, the Convention Against Racial Discrimination, where we are the only country in the world where we have an open complaint by, again, the state of Palestine against the state of Israel that is being discussed there.
Okay, well, Pnina, thank you very much so far. So it is indeed a very complex and not easy to understand issue that we have here. And speaking about the ICC, the ICJ, I mean, I'm not a trained lawyer by profession, and all of us are working ourselves into the details to understand processes, to understand responsibilities, to understand, okay, what can we do here? But that's exactly my question. Speaking here with supporters, friends, and fellows of FELNET from the US, Europe, and Israel, what would you say in such a complex world? I mean, when we see rockets, we know, okay, we have Iron Dome and other tools to protect Israel against rockets and other forms of attacks. But the legal world, the international forums, it's much more complex. So what would you say? What are some potential counter strategies that have to be employed to combat the campaign to delegitimize Israel?
I think first of all, we have to differentiate between, and you asked that beforehand, before those that are making critical remarks about Israel and those that are really delegitimizing Israel or claiming, you know, making these exaggerated claims. And I think by going against the second group and trying to show their bias and that their political stance and that what are their motivations, and the motivation, if you look, for example, the BDS group, if you look at their motivation, the motivation is that Israel will cease to exist as a country. It's not, their motivation is not to end the occupation of 1967. And I think it's also important to understand that their aim is not to enable any kind of peaceful resolution of the conflict. I sit with Palestinians in track 2s. I've been in a few. I have another one next week. And the Palestinians that are ready to talk to Israelis, the moderate Palestinians that want to find some kind of resolution of the conflict, suffer from the BDS mix, yes, from these groups, because they talk to them as if they are traitors, because you're not allowed to talk to Israelis. So I think one thing is to understand and also to explain to people that don't understand that these groups are not there to end the occupation and to protect civilian rights of Palestinians. Those groups are there to see to it that there's no peaceful resolution of the conflict, that there's no state of Israel. They are aligned actually with the Hamas, with the Islamic Jihad in their notions of what should be the outcome. The outcome should be no Israel. One thing, with those that are confused, with those that are making critical remarks without really having an anti-bias against Israel just because of what they see in the media, what they hear in other places, I think the main aim is to explain how complicated it is. And again, I would make, and I already spoke a little about it, to make the differentiation. When we're talking about armed conflict situations, I think it is important, and I've written about it. There's a lot of material about how Israel applies and respects the laws of armed conflict, or IHL, international humanitarian law, when it when it fights, for example, in the Gaza Strip or in Lebanon, and limits itself. Israel could wipe out the Gaza Strip easily. It doesn't do it. It limits itself. It uses very accurate weapons. It tries to minimize harm. It gives warnings. But you must understand, this is one of the most densely populated areas in the world. Everything is civilian. All the terrorists, they operate from civilian houses. They use the civilian homes to put the weapons. They use schools as launching pads. So whatever you do there will be damage to civilians and to civilian objects. There's no option. It's not that there's a military base, but we don't attack it, we attack a civilian house. Everything is civilian. And so I think to try to explain the complexity and again, show what other countries did, your Western countries, when they were fighting in densely populated areas, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, is an important argument. And when it comes to the Palestinian issue of where are we going with the resolution, I think, again, the important thing is to say, I don't think that it is worthwhile saying, the Palestinians have no right, they have no right to self-determination. I think it's a weak argument. And again, personally, I think we need to find some kind of resolution and compromise with the Palestinians, but it's very complicated. What would be the resolution is complicated. The Palestinians themselves don't have any trust in their leadership. So who do you talk to? Who's your partner? Can they deliver if we do make concessions? It is so close, it is so small, it can threaten our security if we leave areas that will be controlled eventually by terrorist organizations. I think just to explain the complexity to those that are ready to hear can help to a certain extent.
Very well, thank you. Before we open the floor to questions from the audience, so please already prepare yourself, and if you already have something in mind, a question or remark, you know how we work it every Monday, just type it either into the chat or raise your hand, and our team is there to guide you right on my screen so that we won't miss any questions from the audience. Pnina, for another second before we open up, let's have a look at this campaign from an internal and an external perspective. So very briefly, what would you say, what are the main threats posed by this campaign to delegitimize Israel, to its security and stability from the internal perspective? And maybe you would also like to comment on if there are any changes now under the recent Israeli government. And then also from the external perspective, how is this campaign actually making well, progress or having an impact on Israel's international relations, first of all in the region, but also from your point of view vis-a-vis Europe and the United States? So what could you say from an internal and an external perspective? What is basically the impact so far of this campaign?
So I'll start with the external one. Externally, of course, it puts pressure on the foreign relations of Israel. So we have, when it comes to governments, usually, first of all, they are more aware of the complexity, and there's also common interests, so usually you can talk to the government members. And personally, also, when I used to meet with people that came from the militaries, from NATO and other militaries, we had very common language, and we used to face the same kind of challenges. I remember in conferences, it was always all the military lawyers and those coming from the government vis-a-vis those coming from human rights organizations. It wasn't split according to countries. It was split according to where do you come from. But when we talk about public opinion in some of these countries, we see that in Europe, we see it also in the US, mainly in the Democratic Party. You see more and more elements that are very critical of Israel. And I think it is a fear that they will eventually also have an impact on the foreign relations of the country. Of course, the relations with the US are one of our cornerstones of our national security. They are very important. This alliance is very important. Europe is very important for security relationship and for economic and other reasons. I think with the EU, we many times see a problem because of the EU's, I would say, a formalistic approach to international law. International law is perceived as something that is that I think links all the countries together. It's like a very general, a very important principle in the EU. And because they have a tendency to look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through a legal lens, as if the law has the answer, and if there's a legal answer, a legal position, so sometimes it makes it difficult to raise considerations that are more practical. We need eventually to make compromises on both sides. It's not going to be resolved by some kind of determination about what is the law. And if we have now an ICJ advisory opinion saying that the occupation is illegal, okay, so what does that mean? So Israel is supposed to tomorrow leave the West Bank, and what will happen there? I mean, so, but again, if it's taken very seriously by the EU, for example, that's a concern. It could even lead potentially to maybe not sanctions, but all kinds of limitations, divestments, and blacklists, etc. So that's the concern externally. Internally, I think again, first of all, I think for Israel it is very important to have this link to the world, and it is important to have this belief in the Israeli right to exist. And now we have our internal challenges, yes, with our government. I'm also not very happy with this government personally. I think one of the problems is that I think this government is less views the international standing of Israel as less important in comparison to going ahead with its ideological goals. And I think that's dangerous for Israel. I think it's dangerous, first of all, internally. I want us to act in a democratic way, to adhere to values that I believe in, of human rights. Also, I don't want Israel to become an isolated country, a pariah country. So I am concerned also with what we see internally.
Okay, thank you very much for your openness. I mean, it's not FELNET's mission to judge or interfere with any politics that's going on in Israel, but for sure, when it comes to how Europe perceives the situation, it's our mission to inform, to educate, to show them on the ground what the situation is in reality. And I mean, of course, we are not there to shift the law in any direction. The law is the law, but for sure, I mean, the law has also to be applied on the current situation on the ground. And I think it's for all of us, it's very important to understand what the situation is, as you rightly said. Very well. I already have some questions from the audience, so please feel free to jump in here. And some I would just read out because I didn't hear anyone who wanted to address it themselves. So maybe you could comment, jumping to the ICC for a second, Pnina. The new ICC prosecutor is not so new at this point any longer. So what's your take on how he will handle the case on Israel?
So Karim Khan, who's British, he's much more practical and pragmatic than the previous, than Fatou Bensouda, the previous prosecutor. I don't think he would have opened the investigation against Israel. I think there was a very strong case why Palestine is not a country, why Palestine, it doesn't have a territory, and you cannot say that the West Bank, all of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem are part of Palestine when it has no control, for sure, in East Jerusalem, but also in parts of the West Bank, and even in the Gaza Strip, it's more the Hamas. So there were very good legal arguments against this determination that the court has jurisdiction. But the problem is that once the investigation has been opened and also approved by the court, by the judges, so it would be very difficult for the prosecutor to close the investigation. In order to close the investigation, it would go again to the court that would have to approve the closure, and they're the ones that approved opening the investigation. So I don't think, I think that's a problematic approach. On the other hand, I don't think he has an interest in going forward so much with this case when there are other cases that are much more serious, and I think he rightfully thinks that they're much more serious. He's very interested in the case on Russia. There's a case of Russia in Ukraine. There's also some cases in Russia with Georgia. There's the Myanmar, with the Rohingya, which is a severe case. There's Libya, there's Sudan. There are some very serious cases that he is Afghanistan with regard to the Taliban and Al Qaeda. So or the Taliban. So I think his focus is there, but there's a lot of pressure put on him to also go ahead with the investigation into Israel. So I don't know what will happen. I do believe that when it comes to war crimes, the allegations on war crimes against Israel, I don't believe that a serious professional prosecutor will really go and prosecute anyone particular or issue a warrant for arrest, because I genuinely don't think that Israel is carrying out war crimes. And it is very, very difficult to prove. You have to prove either that Israel has intentionally killed, intentionally targeted civilians, and since it doesn't intentionally target civilians, I think it's a very difficult case to make. And also you have to prove intention, which is always difficult, even if it did intentionally target civilians. And the other one is more on a proportionality, that it's excessive harm to civilians in comparison to the military advantage. It's a very difficult case. There's been no case until today in any court, including the ICTY, the court in Yugoslavia, and Rwanda, and the ICC until now, that has had a case about proportionality. It's a very difficult case to make as a prosecutor. And again, I think that Israel is acting in a proportionate way, but even if some would beg to differ to prove it and as a war crime, so I'm not sure that it's such an easy case, even if he wanted to pursue it. And the other one is the settlements. Now, with the settlements, it's easier. Another point is that there's the principle of complementarity. So the court is only supposed to deal with cases that are not being investigated genuinely by the country, the relevant country. Since Israel investigates every claim for ill-doing, for war crimes, the allegations, so again, and we have a good legal system, which ties also to the internal issue of one of the threats of weakening the court system and the legal advisors, is that this complementarity argument will be weaker. But at the moment, we have a very good system. We have a very strong argument on proportionality, which is another good reason not to open any case on war crimes. The second one is the settlements. There we don't have proportionality because we don't view it as a war crime. There, I think the main issue is that it is so political. It is linked to an issue. The settlement is one of the issues that it was agreed between the parties that it will be discussed in the framework of the negotiation with the permanent status agreement. And I don't think that the prosecutor would want to go into this political minefield, but I don't know, because again, as I said, there's a lot of pressure.